The rain hammered against the cracked pavement of Maple Street, turning the narrow alley behind Murphy's Diner into a river of discarded dreams and forgotten promises. Marcus Thompson pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his shoulders, the fabric barely keeping the November chill from seeping into his bones. At 63, his weathered hands shook not just from the cold, but from the weight of losing everything he once called home. The foreclosure notice still crumpled in his pocket felt heavier than any gear he'd through the jungles of Vietnam 45 years ago. Beside him, pressed against the brick wall under a torn awning, lay a German Shepherd mix whose amber eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare Marcus recognized in his own reflection. The dog's name was Ranger, a service animal who had been his constant companion for the past 3 years, ever since the VA hospital had matched them during Marcus's darkest period of nightmares and isolation. Ranger. Black and tan coat was soaked through, but the dog never complained, never left Marcus's side, even when the electricity was cut off, even when the bank took the keys to the small house that had been their sanctuary. The diner's back door creaked open, spilling warm yellow light across the wet concrete. Maria Santos, the night manager, appeared with a small container of leftover beef stew and a paper cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. She was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes that had seen too many veterans pass through this same alley, too many stories of men who had given everything for their country, only to find themselves forgotten by the system they had served. Maria never asked questions, never made Marcus feel like charity. She simply understood that sometimes dignity meant accepting help without words. Ranger's ears perked up as Maria approached, but his attention wasn't focused on the food. Instead, the dog's gaze fixed intently on the diner's interior, where a well-dressed man in his 40s sat alone at the corner booth, nervously checking his watch every few minutes. The stranger wore an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the working-class neighborhood, and carried a leather briefcase that he clutched protectively against his chest. Ranger's body language shifted, his posture becoming alert and focused in a way that Marcus had learned to recognize and trust completely. Marcus accepted the warm meal with a grateful nod, but couldn't ignore the way Ranger continued to stare through the door at the mysterious customer. The dog's training had taught him to detect danger, to sense threats before they materialized, but this felt different. Ranger wasn't showing signs of aggression or fear. Instead, his tail wagged slightly, and he made a soft whining sound deep in his throat, the same noise he made when he sensed Marcus was about to have a panic attack and needed comfort. It was as if the dog recognized something familiar about the stranger, something important that demanded attention. The rain began to ease, but Marcus found himself unable to move from their sheltered spot. Ranger had saved his life more than once, not just from physical dangers but from the invisible enemies that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when Marcus was spiraling into depression, arriving at his side with a wet nose and warm presence that pulled him back from the edge of despair. If Ranger thought the stranger was significant, then Marcus knew better than to ignore that instinct, even if he couldn't understand what his four-legged partner had sensed. Through the diner's steamed windows, Marcus watched as the man in the suit checked his phone repeatedly, his fingers drumming against the briefcase with obvious anxiety. The stranger ordered nothing but coffee, leaving most of it untouched as he scanned the empty restaurant with darting eyes. Maria moved between tables, wiping down surfaces and refilling salt shakers, but Marcus noticed how she kept glancing at the nervous customer with the same protective warness she showed toward the veterans who sought refuge in her establishment. Something about the man's behavior felt wrong, predatory in a way that set everyone's instincts on edge. Ranger suddenly stood and padded closer to the door, his wet paws leaving prints on the concrete as he positioned himself where he could maintain visual contact with the stranger. The dog's breathing was steady but focused, his ears swiveling to track every sound from inside the diner. Marcus had seen this behavior before, during their training sessions at the VA hospital, when Ranger would lock onto a specific person in a crowd and refuse to be distracted until Marcus acknowledged the target. The dog possessed an almost supernatural ability to read human intentions, to separate genuine kindness from those who might wish harm to his vulnerable partner. As the minutes passed, more pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. The stranger kept checking the alley where Marcus and Ranger had taken shelter, his gaze lingering on their shadowy forms with an intensity that made Marcus's combat instincts flare to life. This wasn't casual curiosity or idle observation. The man was studying them, evaluating them, planning something that required careful timing and preparation. Marcus's military training kicked in, cataloging exits and potential weapons, assessing the tactical situation with skills that 4 decades of civilian life had never fully erased. Maria appeared again, this time carrying a thick envelope that she pressed into Marcus's hands along with a set of keys. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she explained that her late brother's apartment above the hardware store 2 blocks away had been sitting empty for months, and she needed someone trustworthy to house sit while she figured out what to do with his belongings. The timing felt miraculous, but Marcus caught the way her eyes darted toward the diner's interior, suggesting that her generosity might be motivated by more than simple kindness. Ranger remained focused on the stranger throughout this exchange, his professional training evident in the way he maintained surveillance without appearing threatening or aggressive. The dog had been taught to be invisible when necessary, to blend into the background while keeping his humans safe from threats both obvious and subtle. But as Maria handed over the keys, Ranger's demeanor shifted again, his tail wagging with what appeared to be approval or satisfaction, as if the dog understood that this development was exactly what they needed to move forward with whatever mission he had identified. The apartment above Patterson Hardware Store smelled of sawdust and old leather, filled with the accumulated treasures of a man who had lived alone but surrounded himself with projects and possibilities. Maria's brother had been a craftsman, his workbench covered with hand tools that gleamed despite their age, his shelves lined with books about woodworking, military history, and small-town politics. Marcus felt an immediate connection to this space, recognizing the organized chaos of a man who found peace in working with his hands and purpose in fixing things that others might have discarded as beyond repair. Ranger wasted no time in beginning his exploration, nose to the floor as he methodically examined every corner of the small living space. The dog's search wasn't random or playful, it was systematic and professional. The same methodical approach he used when checking Marcus's medication schedule or detecting the early signs of an anxiety attack. Within minutes, Ranger had focused his attention on a section of hardwood flooring near the bedroom closet, pawing gently at a loose board that creaked under pressure. Marcus knelt beside his companion, running his fingers along the edges of the floorboard until he found the mechanism that allowed it to lift away. Beneath the wood was a carefully constructed hiding place, lined with plastic and containing a metal box that had been sealed against moisture and time. The container bore the distinctive markings of military storage, suggesting that Maria's brother had been more than just a small-town craftsman. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth, Marcus discovered medals and ribbons that told the story of service in Korea, Vietnam, and the early years of the Cold War. But these weren't just any military decorations. As Marcus examined them more closely, He recognized the distinctive design of medals that had been reported stolen from the VA regional office 6 months earlier. The theft had made headlines throughout the veterans community, not because of the monetary value of the items, but because they represented the sacrifice and honor of men who had never received proper recognition for their service. Among the stolen items was a Medal of Honor that had been destined for the family of a soldier who had died saving his squad in Vietnam, a ceremony that had been postponed indefinitely pending the investigation. Ranger's discovery suddenly made perfect sense. The nervous stranger in the diner hadn't been there by coincidence. He had been watching Marcus, evaluating whether the homeless veteran might be useful in whatever scheme he was planning. The dog's instincts had detected the predatory nature of someone who viewed veterans as easy targets, vulnerable people whose desperation might make them willing accomplices in crimes against their own brothers. But Ranger had also sensed something else of the opportunity to right a terrible wrong and restore honor to those who deserved recognition. Marcus spent the next hour examining the contents of the hidden box, finding not just medals but also documentation that revealed the scope of the theft and the identity of those responsible. Maria's brother hadn't been a criminal. He had been an investigator, a former military police officer who had uncovered evidence of corruption within the VA system. The medals were evidence, carefully preserved along with photographs, bank records, and witness statements that painted a picture of systematic theft and fraud targeting the veterans community. The trail led back to several individuals, including the nervous man in the diner who had been using his position as a VA contractor to identify and steal valuable military artifacts. These criminals had been preying on grieving families and struggling veterans, convincing them to sell priceless medals for far less than their worth, then reselling them to private collectors who cared nothing about their historical significance. Maria's brother had been building a case against them when he died suddenly of a heart attack, taking his investigation with him to the grave. But now, thanks to Ranger's remarkable intuition, that investigation could be completed. Marcus found himself faced with a choice that would define not just his immediate future, but his sense of purpose and dignity. He could take this evidence to the authorities and ensure that justice was served, but doing so would require him to step out of the shadows and become visible again in a world that had seemed determined to forget him. The alternative was to remain invisible, to let the crimes continue while he focused on his own survival. Ranger settled beside Marcus as he wrestled with this decision, the dog's warm presence providing the comfort and clarity that had sustained them through their darkest moments together. In the German shepherd's steady gaze, Marcus saw not judgment or pressure, but absolute faith in his ability to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. The next morning brought crisp autumn sunshine that streamed through the apartment windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits celebrating the dawn of something new. Marcus had made his decision during the sleepless night, and Ranger seemed to sense the shift in his human's demeanor. The dog's tail wagged with anticipation as Marcus carefully packed the evidence into a sturdy canvas bag, the same type of field pack that had accompanied them on countless training exercises and therapeutic outings. The walk to the VA regional office took them past familiar landmarks, the diner where Maria had shown them kindness, the alley where they had nearly given up hope, the small park where Ranger had learned to trust humans again after his own difficult journey through the service animal training program. Each step felt significant, part of a journey that had transformed them both from survivors into something greater. They were no longer just victims of circumstance. They had become agents of justice and healing. Detective Sarah Williams had been investigating the medal thefts for months, following leads that seemed to evaporate as quickly as they appeared. When Marcus walked into her office with Ranger at his side, She initially assumed he was another veteran seeking help with a disability claim or housing issue. But as he began laying out the evidence from Maria's brother's investigation, her expression shifted from polite attention to intense focus. Here was the breakthrough she had been hoping for, delivered by the most unlikely of messengers. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Bank records showed patterns of suspicious transactions. Photographs captured meetings between the thieves and their criminal network, and witness statements provided testimony from veterans who had been victimized by the scheme. But most importantly, the hidden metals could be traced back to specific thefts, providing physical proof that would make conviction almost certain. Detective Williams realized she was looking at months of professional investigative work, compiled by a man who had died before he could see justice served. Within days, the arrests began. The nervous man from the diner was taken into custody along with several accomplices, their network of metal trafficking exposed and dismantled. The stolen decorations were returned to their rightful recipients, including the Medal of Honor that was finally presented to the family of the Vietnam soldier who had died saving his squad. Marcus found himself invited to the ceremony, not as a recipient of charity, but as a guest of honor whose courage had made the healing possible. Standing in the VFW hall surrounded by fellow veterans and their families, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of belonging and purpose that transcended his personal struggles. Ranger sat beside him in perfect military bearing, his service vest gleaming with ribbons that marked their shared journey from desperation to dignity. The dog's presence reminded everyone present that healing often comes through unexpected partnerships, that sometimes salvation arrives on four paws and offers comfort without judgment or conditions. The investigation's conclusion brought more than just criminal justice. It opened doors that had seemed permanently closed. The VA offered Marcus a position as a peer counselor, recognizing that his experiences with homelessness and recovery gave him unique insights into the challenges facing struggling veterans. The job came with housing assistance and healthcare benefits, but more importantly, it provided the sense of mission that he had lost when his military service ended decades earlier. Maria's generosity evolved into a lasting friendship built on mutual respect and shared commitment to serving their community. She had known intuitively that Marcus was someone who could be trusted with her brother's legacy, and her faith had been rewarded beyond her wildest expectations. The hardware store apartment became Marcus's permanent home, a place where he and Ranger could build new routines and relationships, while honoring the memory of the investigator whose work had given their lives new meaning. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a group of newly graduated service dogs and their veteran partners, sharing the story of how Ranger had saved not just his life, but his sense of purpose and dignity. The German Shepherd sat at attention beside the podium, his professional bearing a testament to the power of the human-animal bond that transcends simple companionship to become genuine partnership. These dogs weren't just pets or medical devices. They were colleagues and battle buddies whose instincts and loyalty made them invaluable allies in the ongoing fight for veteran welfare. I'd love to hear where you're listening to this story from, and whether you have your own experiences with service animals or veteran support in your community. Share your thoughts about the incredible bond between veterans and their four-legged partners, because these relationships represent some of the most powerful healing stories in our society today. The program Marcus helped develop became a model for other VA centers, combining traditional counseling with practical investigation skills that empowered veterans to advocate for themselves and their brothers in arms. Ranger's role evolved as well. The dog became something of a mascot for the program, his calm presence providing comfort to veterans who were struggling with their own transitions from military to civilian life. Together, they proved that sometimes the most effective therapy comes not from textbooks or clinical protocols, but from genuine understanding and shared experience. As evening settled over their small apartment, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them from that rainy alley to this place of stability and purpose. Ranger lay at his feet, no longer a service dog assigned to a broken veteran, but a true partner in a mission that honored the sacrifice and dignity of all who had served. The medals that had started their adventure were now safely returned to their rightful owners, but the bonds forged through that investigation continued to strengthen and multiply throughout their community. The work was far from finished. Every day brought new veterans who needed support, new families seeking answers about missing decorations or benefits, new opportunities to transform individual healing into collective action. Marcus and Ranger faced each challenge with the same methodical approach that had solved their first case, trusting in their partnership and the network of allies who had joined their cause. They had learned that sometimes the greatest victories come not from dramatic battles, but from patient investigation and unwavering commitment to justice. Please consider supporting missions like this by subscribing and sharing these stories with others who might need to hear them, because every veteran deserves to know that their service matters and their struggles are understood. The bond between veterans and their service animals represents hope that healing is always possible, even when the path forward seems impossible to find. Tonight, as Marcus prepares for another day of counseling and advocacy, and Ranger settles into his favorite spot by the window, both understand that their greatest adventure isn't behind them, but ahead of them, in the lives they'll continue to touch and the healing they'll help facilitate in a community that has finally learned to honor both the service of its veterans and the loyalty of the remarkable animals who serve alongside them. Their story continues with every veteran who finds hope, every family that receives closure, and every service dog that discovers their perfect human partner. Thank you for joining us for this story of loyalty recovery and the power of second chances. Be sure to catch our next tale of courage and companionship, and remember to take a moment to honor the veterans and service families in your own community who continue to serve long after their official duty has ended.